And so with that Bodhichitta motivation in mind, then we'll do the verse of refuge in Bodhichitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So I guess we'll just return to the text. No discussion as we go along, I suppose. And for those of you who are following along, we're like down a little past the middle of page 9. Yeah, and of course, you'll know we're in the section on Sautantrika and the subsection on their way of asserting objects. We've covered the main points. I'll just, on this section, I'm just going to briefly go through the last few points here. So this is, continuing, and and again, I think the key points for their way of asserting objects was what we talked about. Their way of asserting ultimate truths and conventional truths in every system. That's really key, isn't it? And then also negative phenomena and positive phenomena, and the kinds of negative phenomena, right? Non-affirming negatives and affirming negatives. Those are going to be important. Those are important to this school and also to all the other schools, right? Like so, and you need to know what a non-affirming negative is when you get to, for example, the Madhyamikas and so on. So that and that's where those kind of ideas are introduced in the Sautantrika system. But anyway, so we covered that already. So then we're up to here it says another way of dividing existence, right, or existent objects, is into single phenomena and different phenomena. And I just want to point out that you may wonder, like, why. I mean, there may be various reasons why they mention that there, but I want to point out one is, one of the meditations on selflessness or emptiness, isn't it, that those of you who have studied for a while know, right, is if a thing exists, right? Remember that the meditation, it's in the Lamrim, right, where it says, for example, if the self exists, it has to be singular or plural, right? It has to be one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates, right? And there is no other possibility, right? Remember that meditation for those who've studied Lamrim. Well, this is part of that, right? In other words, that existent phenomena have to either be one or many, right? Have to be one thing or different things. And so this distinction is relevant sometimes for our meditation practice. Anyway, and then it goes through there. It'll describe what single phenomena and different phenomena are. But so it says there are two types of single phenomena: false singles and true singles. And then I'll just read what it says and then explain. So it says examples of a false single is the object of knowledge. Examples of false single is object of knowledge and generally characterized phenomena. Examples of true single is thing and impermanent phenomena. So what they're getting at here is, so first of all, a single thing, right, would be like a tree, right? Or, a pen or a cup right? It would be a single thing that we identify. And what they're pointing out is that false singles would be conventional truths, right? So what they say, when they say false, what they mean is that it doesn't exist as it appears to exist, right? And that's because, as we've talked about, right, conventional truths, like the conventional truth of tree, right, is a generally characterized phenomenon, which is your idea of a tree, right? And that appears to be a tree to us, right? But it's not. It's just a mental image. It's a generally characterized phenomena, right? It's created, as we talked about last time, it's created through a process of negating everything that's not tree. And then you give rise to a kind of image of tree. So that's false in the sense that it appears to be a tree, but it's not a tree. Right? Whereas a true single, when they say, it would be a single thing and an impermanent phenomenon, right? So that would be an actual, like if I look out the window and my eye consciousness sees a tree, that's a true single, right? It's an actual, and remember, because why is it a true thing? Because it can produce effects from its own side. Actually, the tree I see out there produces seeds, right? Animals eat them and whatever, they fall to the ground and so on, right? So whereas if I close my eyes and I give rise, so actually just to give a very simplistic example, right? If I close my eyes and think of that tree, immediately an image comes to mind, like of the tree, because I've seen it so many times, right? And then I think, oh yeah, that's the tree in the front of the house, right? But actually, it's not the tree in the front of the house. So that's why it's a false single. Does that make sense? Whereas if I open my eyes and look out the window and I see whatever, the squirrel climbing up the tree, for example, that's a true single because it's an impermanent phenomena and it's a specific thing, right? It's not a generally characterized category or generally characterized image. It's the actual tree, according to this school. So that's the difference between false singles and true singles. So again, it's pointing out, first of all, that there are singular things, and also that they can be conventional truths or ultimate truths, right? Conventional truths being false, ultimate truths being true. And then it says there are two types of different phenomena, false difference and true difference. It's going to be the same thing, right? So the example of a false different is the pair, the isolate of a pot and the isolate of a pillar, right? The example of a true different is the pair, pot and pillar, right? So what it's pointing out is that there you can have existent phenomena can be two or more things that are different from each other, right? So a true difference would be if you have an actual pillar and an actual pot in front of you, right? Those are truly existent according to this school, right? Which would other schools, as you know, like the mind-only school and the Madhyamikas would disagree with, but in this school, those are truly existent and they truly exist, right? And they exist from their own side. They can perform a function from their own side. Anyway, but they're different from each other, right? A pot serves a different function than a pillar, right? Or you could say if you were, a true different, for example, if you were in your garden and you had like a seed for growing watermelons and a seed for growing tomatoes, right? They would be a true different, right? They each perform a function from their own side. They're each truly existent, but one will give rise from its own side to watermelons and the other will give rise from its own side to tomatoes if they're watered and planted and watered and so on. Whereas the example of a false different, again, isolate, right? Remember we talked about that? Isolate implies negation, right? So the isolate of a pot is your mental image of a pot, and you're isolating that from all other things. So in other words, you have to recognize a pot is not a cup, a pot is not a tree, a pot is not a house, whatever. A pot's not a plate either, right? So your isolate is your mental, your generally characterized image, or your mental isolate, you can call it, of a pot, and your isolate of a pillar. Those are two ideas of things, or two images of things. They're different from each other. And what's important is, and they're false because they're not an actual pot and they're not an actual pillar, right? They're your mental images of those. So again, if you understood conventional truths and ultimate truths, then these aren't hard to understand, right? That they're singular things and they're plurals. But to understand what they're getting at, you have to understand conventional ultimate truths, right? Why they're saying some are false and some are true. Okay. So that was the end. That completes that section on Sautantrika's way of asserting objects. So maybe what I'll start in on now their way of asserting object possessors, right? So remember, each of these, each chapter of the book is going to have 7 subsections. So now we're up to the 5th of the Sautantrika subsections, which is their way of asserting object possessors. And I'll just remind you, throughout this text, object possessors means awareness, right? It means subject, a subject, right? The subject and object. So objects would be the things out there. Object possessors would mean object possessors means that which perceives, right? So the perceiver of, or say perceiver. That which, the subject, that's probably the best way to say it. The subject, right, versus object. So object possessors. So I'll just start in here what it says. So there are 2 assertions among the Sautantrikas. and this is about what is the, each school, there's this question of what is the illustration of a person, right? There is what's the referent when we say person? And according to this school, some assert the continuum of the aggregates to be the illustration of the person, and some assert the mental consciousness to be the illustration of the person. An example of the first, meaning those who assert that the aggregates continuum is the illustration of a person, are those who follow the treasure of manifest knowledge, the Abhidharma. An example of a proponent of sutra who follows this, so the second, right, those who assert that the consciousness, mental consciousness is the illustration of the person, are proponents of sutra who follow the 7 treatises on valid cognition. Right, so those are the texts of Dharmakirti. So those are the sharper facultied, right, Svatantrikas, those who follow reasoning and who follow the tradition of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, really. And I just want to point out, so why do some say it's the aggregates and some say, so you can see how, like, I just want to point out, right, like in the Treasury of Abhidharma approach, right, they often point out, well, what do we label the person onto? The 5 aggregates, right? There is sometimes you see the person, right? And actually, so you can see the logic, first of all, behind the first, right? Somebody would say it's the continuum of the aggregates. Because, for example, if I look and see Varahi, I'm not seeing her mind, but I say, oh, there's Varahi, right? And so we can say, well, so that's an illustration of a person, right? In that case, it's the form aggregate. But then if I were to say, Varahi is very kind, then I'm referring to her, her part of her mental continuum, right? Her compositional factors and so on, right? So I could, when you think of a person, yourself or somebody else, sometimes you're referring to one aggregate and sometimes to another, and those are what we view as the person, right? So from that perspective, you can see why some people would say, well, the continuum of the aggregates is the illustration of the person. That's what we refer to when we say person. Those who assert the second, right, that it's the mental consciousness is the illustration of the person. What they have a couple of arguments that I'll just mention very briefly. So these are logicians, right? A lot, these are people who follow the and so one is they would say, well, if the illustration of the person is the 5 aggregates, not all beings have 5 aggregates. For example, beings in the formless realm don't have form. So how could the 5 aggregates, then you would say, the person who's in the formless realm is not a person. So they would say there's a logical flaw there, right? So you can't, so they would argue, that's one reason they would say, well, you can't say that the 5 aggregates are always the person, because some persons don't have the form aggregate, for example. Another argument they make is they say, well, it's the karmic imprints are left on the mind, not the body. And at the time of death, we leave behind the body and take rebirth, right? And there are many sutras that say so-and-so, whatever, this person did this positive action and died and was reborn in the heavenly realms. This person did a negative action and died and was reborn in the hell realms. And so they would say, if it's the 5 aggregates, then what is that? Then that would not be tenable, because some of the aggregates are left behind at the time of death, but the consciousness goes on. So they would say the illustration of the person must be the mental consciousness, because that's what goes from life to life and carries the seeds of karma. So those are the reasons why some assert one thing and some assert another within this school. What's the illustration of a person, right? And you can imagine, right? Actually, both are. You can see how somebody could assert either of those ideas, and they've debated about it. So, and I want to point out the implication here, right, though, is when we're talking about subject, right, object possessor or subject, that which is a subject in relation to an object. So what this is saying is what the implication is of this first paragraph, we'll call it, is that one way of asserting what's an object possessor is a person, right? So there is people perceive, so they're saying, so one way of, so sometimes we can say an awareness is the object possessor, right? The consciousness itself. But another way of saying it is, well, the person, right? So if I said, I'll guess, Lisa saw a bear. I know you hike, so I'm guessing. But if I were to say Lisa saw a bear, right, I'm not saying, then I'm asserting a person saw a bear, right? So then they would say, so what's the person? Is it Lisa's 5 aggregates or is it her consciousness, right? Which is Lisa, and they're saying, well, the illustration of Lisa, you could say is her 5 aggregates or is her consciousness, either way, depending which of these assertions you agree with. But that being an example where you're saying the person is the object possessor and the subject in that case would be the bear. By the way, would the bear be, if she saw a bear with her eyes, would it be a conventional truth or an ultimate truth? It would be an ultimate truth, right? Because it would be an actual, right? It would be a bear that can perform a function from its own side. It can eat berries, for example. And it would be single, right? It would be a true single according to the category we just did, right? If she saw one bear, if she saw a whole family of bears, it would be a true different, right? There'd be different things there. Be a number of bears, for example. But so one way of asserting what's an object possessor, or meaning a subject, is persons, and a person could be asserted to be the 5 aggregates, or it could be asserted to be consciousness. But then they go on, and this is going to be there's going to be a lot of detail on this next assertion, which is another way of asserting what's an object possessor is it's an awareness, a consciousness, right? And so it says here, now it gets into awareness, right? Meaning that's a kind of object possessor. So it says, the definition of awareness is that which is clear and knowing. And I just want to pause there. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but that is a humongous topic, isn't it, in Buddhism, right? The definition of awareness, that which is clear and knowing. And if you want to think of, in Buddhism, when you want to analyze, the existence of past and future lives, you analyze consciousness, which is clear and knowing. If you want to meditate on consciousness, right, which is technically, we call it sometimes Mahamudra, right, then you meditate on awareness. You start, actually, eventually you have to meditate on emptiness, but you start by meditating on awareness itself, which is clear and knowing, right? And so it's a huge subject, which we're not going to go into detail on here because it's not the main topic, but that's an important definition. And I guess I'm pausing partly to note, these are this school and its assertions are very important to all Buddhist schools. Does that make sense? So you could say, well, I'm a Madhyamaka, I'm not a Sautrantika, but it's the Sautrantikas who in these 4 tenet systems, right, who first assert awareness is that which is clear and knowing. That assertion becomes important at all different levels of Buddhist practice, right? Because we want to meditate on consciousness itself sometimes. So, especially if we're doing Mahamudra practice. Okay, so the definition of awareness is that which is clear and knowing. By the way, it can't just be clear, right? Because you could say a clear sky, right? But a clear sky is not consciousness because it doesn't know. And you can also it can't just be knowing that which it knows, because, for example, a person knows, right? But a person is not clear. A person has form, a person has other aggregates. So anyway, then there are 2 types of awareness: valid cognizers and non-valid cognizers. And by the way, this term valid cognizer is an important term, and that's something to say valid cognizer or authoritative cognizer. Very different translations of that. But that phrase, valid cognizer, is pramana in Sanskrit. And, so this comes from that literature, the pramana literature. And when you look at the Geshe studies program at the great monasteries, pramana is one of the 5 main topics, right? So Khensa Rinpoche is a Geshe, many of the teachers we meet are Geshes. So it means they study 5 main topics, and one of the main topics they study is pramana. So this comes from that. Does that make sense? This is from the pramana tradition. Anyway, so there are 2 types of cognizers: valid and non-valid cognizers. And I'm not going to explain that because it's going to go into humongous detail on what is a valid cognizer and what's a non-valid. Not humongous detail is like the Pramana of Arctica, which is a very huge book. But this is going to be a good introduction to this. The tenets here just introduces us to those topics. Okay, and this is an interesting, so now it's going to give the definition of a valid cognizer, of a pramana. So it says the definition of a valid cognizer is a new, incontrovertible knower. And And actually, for those who are interested in, again, in pramana, this is a very important foundational definition. So it's a new, incontrovertible knower. And the author now goes on to describe those. We'll continue on. In outlining the definition of a valid cognizer, it is necessary to mention these three: new, incontrovertible, and knower. Right? So the three components of the definition, those three. And then he notes that new is necessary because it eliminates subsequent cognizers being valid cognizers. Incontrovertible eliminates correct assumptions from being valid cognizers. And knower eliminates the physical sense powers from being valid cognizers. And so I'll just pause and give a very brief sort of say a few things about this. One is this point about new, right? So a new cognizer. All the Buddhist tenet systems that speak about pramana say that a valid cognizer has to be a new cognizer, except for one. The Prasangika Madhyamikas say new is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if it's new. So that's a unique tenet of the Prasangika Madhyamikas, right? The consequentialist Prasangika Madhyamika philosophers. They say it doesn't need to be new, but all other Buddhist philosophers assert that valid cognition must be new cognizer. And so new means it can't be subsequent, right? So it means so what they're getting at is it's that first cognition when you realize something. And it could, anyway, we'll get into it. It could be a first knower that's a sense consciousness, or a first knower that's a mental consciousness. But it's that first moment of knowing something, right? So that's when they say new, not a subsequent moment of knowing the same thing. So there's a kind of newness or freshness to valid cognition, according to this school. Incontrovertible says it eliminates correct assumptions. So this means, incontrovertible means what? It means like, it can't, that for the, it's like, oh, wow, what do you say? Like, if somebody says, I saw it with my own eyes, right? There's a sense in which like, incontrovertible is like that. I'm just using a common saying here. But like, so they talk about versus correct assumption. Like correct assumption would be where you believe something that's true, but you're not really sure. Does that make sense? But here they're saying it's incontrovertible in the sense that like, you know it for sure, right? It can't be, somebody can't, like if you saw, I just looked out the window. If I see that same tree, right, I just looked out the window and see it's green, the leaves are green, right? And if later somebody said to me, no, those leaves are not green, I wouldn't doubt myself. Does that make sense? Because it was in that case, it's a direct perception. I saw it with my own eyes, right? It's incontrovertible. And they also get it that, and this also applies, we'll get into it later, but this incontrovertible element can also apply to logic, right? Like when somebody realizes something through logic, and they're getting at a point here, which is there's a difference between, I say it the right way. I guess I'll say it this way, that even later, it will not be reversed. That's one way of saying what's incontrovertible, is when somebody knows something in a kind of definitive way. Maybe that's a good way to put it. So even later, it's not going to be reversed. And then a knower, right? Meaning, a knower, an awareness. And here he says, this author says, knower eliminates physical sense powers from being valid cognizers. Remember, I don't know if you remember this, but in the Vaibhashika system, they uniquely asserted that sense powers could be, what's the word? Could be cognizers. And here in this tenet system, the sense powers are unique empowering conditions that allow, like, so, is that your eye sense power allows you to cognize a visual object, but it doesn't know it. It has to be a consciousness. That's what this school says. Whereas the Vaibhashikas were saying sense powers, which are physical, can know. All the other Buddhist schools from this Sautantrikas on up say a knower has to be a consciousness, and that the sense powers are empowering conditions that allow consciousness to know. So your visual consciousness knows a visual object. The visual sense power, like your eye sense power, is an empowering condition that allows for that, but it's not the knower itself. The knower has to be awareness, or knower. Yeah, knower meaning awareness. So that's why according to this school, a valid cognizer or pramana is a new, incontrovertible knower. And I'll go on one more step and then I'll pause for questions because I think it's a good point to pause after the next point. So we're continuing on with valid cognizers, right? And next, so that's the definition of a valid cognizer and the little explanation of the definition. And then it points out there are two types of valid cognizers: direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers. And so the definition of a direct perceiver is a non-mistaken knower free from conceptuality. And the definition of a direct valid cognizer is a new incontrovertible knower free from conceptuality. So, and I'll just say a comment on that and then I'll pause. Like, what this is getting at is that, first of all, when it says there are two types of valid cognizers, I just mentioned that, right? So right, if a valid cognizer is a new incontrovertible knower, one type is direct valid cognition. So what they're saying is direct valid cognition is non-conceptual. And what's an example of that, right? An example of a direct valid cognition would be an eye consciousness seeing blue, right? Or an eye consciousness seeing green, or a tongue consciousness tasting sweet, right? So in other words, that's not conceptual. It's when your eye conscious actually sees color or shape, it's a direct perception. It's not cognitive, right? And the same with taste, right? When your tongue actually tastes something, it's a direct perception. That's different from an inferential valid cognizer, which is something we'll get into later. It comes later in the text, but which arises through the power of reasoning, right? It arises through the power of a correct sign, they say, which means a reason. So those are the two ways to come to valid cognition. And here they first get into direct valid cognizers. And I'll just go back to what they said here, just to point out one more distinction. They said the definition of a direct perceiver is a non-mistaken knower free of conceptuality, right? Versus a direct valid cognizer is a new incontrovertible knower free from conceptuality. So not all direct perceptions are valid cognitions, right? And why? Because, and we'll get into this again, the text will explain this as we go along, but we said new. Part of the definition of a valid cognizer is something new, right? The first moment of perceiving. And so subsequent moments of a direct perceiver are non-mistaken, but they're not valid. They're not pramana. They're not valid cognition in the sense that they're not new, right? If you're staring at something, that first moment when you see it is a direct valid cognizer. If you continue to look at it, they wouldn't call that, in this school, they would no longer call that a direct valid cognizer. They would say you're directly perceiving it and it's unmistaken, but it's no longer, those second moments wouldn't be pramana or direct valid cognizers. They would be direct perceivers because they're not new anymore, according to, remember, because that's part of the definition. Maybe I should pause there. We're going to go into more about direct valid cognizers and their types and then inferential and so on. But any questions, I guess, before I go on? I don't want people to be confused if we're continuing on. Lynn, yeah.
This comes from legal training, but eyewitness testimony is inherently unreliable. It's much less reliable than documents or anything else you have, okay? So, and I don't think even seeing the tree is free from conceptuality. I mean, you have a concept of what a tree is, and even though you think you see the tree, which is green, okay, there could be atmospheric conditions, there could be a glass, there could be lots of reasons that you don't know about, lots of facts that you don't know about that makes a tree green to you when in fact it's not. Or it's not green in the sense you think it's green. So I don't think any of us, I mean, in the common sense, and maybe this is something different, can perceive things with our eyes that are free from conceptual conceptual. I just don't, I mean, it like comes like police violence against Black people. It's the same thing. They see something that's probably all of us in this class would not see when they see a Black person. Okay, so it's all bound up in this conceptuality that they see, in that case, bias, but I don't think we see anything free from concepts.
That's an interesting point. I'm just pausing the it's really interesting point, is it? Because I mean, if you think about it, first of all, I mean, different Buddhist schools would respond to that differently. So I'm trying, like a Prasangika would respond to that in one way, but I'm trying to think about the response from a Sautrantika to that, you know, because and I guess what I'll say is this is like, so it's an interesting point, isn't it? So like a Prasangika philosopher would say, you know, things exist in mere name, so that there's always, in a sense, right, conceptuality. This school, though, I would point out, like this school is getting at something, how to say it the right way. What this school is saying, I want to go back to like their view, right? Because actually it's an interesting point, right? Direct valid cognizer. So what they're saying is like, if you, I want to go back to ultimate truth according to this school, right? This school says, and I want to, actually I should slow down. I should slow down and explain clearly, like, according to this school, right, that which is perceived by a direct perceiver free from conceptuality, according to them, exists ultimately. So, and I guess, so what they're getting at in a way is like, how, actually, they're getting at something very simplistic in a way, or very basic, maybe not simplistic, but basic, which is like, I want to go back to even the definition of an existent, according to the school. And I'm going to use the example of tree, right? So they say, like a tree, how do we, in what sense, let's see this right. So a tree, first of all, for a tree to exist, it has to be able to be perceived, right? Because that which exists is something suitable, according to this school, that which is an existent phenomena is something suitable to be perceived by a consciousness. And according to this school, a tree can perform a function from its own side and therefore is ultimately existent from its own side. So according to this school, what they're getting is something very simplistic in a way. And I guess I want to differentiate, because this school would agree with some points you're saying, but, you know, but not all. Like, so what this school would basically say is, if a person directly perceives, has a direct valid cognition of a tree, right, where they're like, and so what they're getting at in a way is like, oh, sorry, I say it right, like, yeah, this school would actually say, really, you know, is like, when I open, if I go outside, if I stand next to a tree and open my eyes and look directly at the tree, I'm directly perceiving with a valid, like, let's say, so I walk outside and I open my eyes and I see the tree. And what they're saying is, in that one moment, that very first moment, so there's not conceptuality yet, is one point. There will be conceptuality. According to this school, what they're saying is then concepts do come in. Like you might say, I like that kind of tree. I don't like that kind of tree. I wish that tree weren't here. You know, whatever, who planted the tree? There's all kinds of cognitions and concepts that could come in the second moment. But this school is getting at something, actually, a really important point you're raising, Lynn. So from this school's perspective, so I just want to describe it. I want to go into really like this moment. Because what this school is saying really is, there's a single moment there where you, like, so you walk outside and you look up and wow, there's the tree, right? And that moment, that singular moment is a direct valid cognizer. And what they're saying is that moment is incontrovertible. In other words, that, and what they would say is, you know, the person directly perceived a tree with their eyes. Or if you hugged it, you felt it with your hands or something. And that what it perceived is truly existent. And they would say, otherwise, you're getting into a kind of nihilism. Now, they would agree with some points that you made. They would say, now if you start, once you cognize, well, the cognitions we'll get into, there are all kinds of cognitions that we could have. They could be valid, they could be invalid, they could be, we could believe them very strongly and it could still be false. That they would agree with all that. But what they say is that there are these individual moments of valid cognition, which are what certify that things exist, actually. And that without that, you're left in a kind of, they would actually say that in a way, right? That if without that grounding in valid cognition, you're left in a kind of, sorry to say this right, like you're left in a sort of nihilistic,
relative. It's like a relative.
That's the word, relative. I couldn't think of the word, relativism. And that's not how things are. That's sort of, and I want to go back even to like some of these different examples. Like, so they wouldn't debate, this school, philosophers in this school wouldn't debate that there's bias. They would say, of course there's bias. But they would say, we're talking about something much more basic than that. We're talking about like, in an individual moment, like there are states where you can have doubt, right? Like if you see something in a distance and is it a scarecrow or is it a person? Well, there's doubt. Then we'll get into that. That would be an example of doubt in this school. But they're saying like, if I'm like standing next to somebody and I turn, if somebody's right next to me, I turn and look, I saw a person, and they would say that, for example, in that moment where you turn and saw there's a person there, if you saw a person, you saw a person. And that's a direct valid cognition according to this school. And that person is truly existent. And so that's this school's stance. But go ahead.
So you're taking out memory. Okay, so it's in that moment. I understand that. You're taking out memory, which is deficient in everybody, but it's still conceptually bound the way I see it. I mean, how would you have a word to describe a tree? How would you know that that's different than the brush around the tree or whatever, or the grass?
And that's an interesting point, which we'll get into that more as we go along. But in terms of, I mean, so you're right. We'll get into more about how the school views perception, which is part of what you're getting at. And that there are the concepts, but this school is saying concepts come later. That at first, according to this school, with direct valid cognition, the first moment is a direct non-conceptual. That's the way they're defining it. A direct non-conceptual, in this case, where we're talking about direct valid cognition, right? So direct valid cognition is always non-conceptual. They just said that here, right? Free from conceptuality. So according to this school, all the concepts we give rise to actually arise based upon non-conceptual moments of awareness. And you really have to, I guess I just want to point this out, to understand this school. So I think it's great that you're asking these questions, that we can all think about them. Because this school is very much, if you really understand what they're getting at here, this school is really talking about, actually it's very tricky in a way, because one point is that that first moment of valid cognition, right? Where your eye conscious sees a tree or something. We're not aware of that. In other words, ordinary people, according to this school, actually, this school itself would say ordinary people in ordinary life aren't aware of that because a moment is so brief. And what this school would say is that happens, and then without us noticing it, they would say if you were to introspect and really watch your mind, in meditation it would have to be, what you would find is there's this first moment of, say, I'm using the example of eye consciousness. Like, actually, I'm going to give a personal example, just a very simplistic one for a moment. I remember once, when I was first practicing Buddhism, I remember once I went somewhere and did a retreat, and I was sitting, like, I happened to have a seat where there was a window, right? And I was sitting, you're supposed to sit with your eyes open, and it was winter time in Vermont, and I was sort of watching my breath, and my eyes were open, and suddenly, like the wind blew the snow in a kind of little mini, what do you call it, twister thing. And And because I was meditating, I was like aware, like I was actually kind of more aware than usual. I was like, at first there was just this visual impression, right? Of, even to call it shape would be, it was shape, but to call it shape is language. And then, right, oh, like so quickly, right, I thought, wow, oh, how pretty. Oh, it's impermanent. Oh, I'm impermanent, right? And those were all concepts. And what this school is saying is there's the first moment, which is direct perception that's non-conceptual, which we are almost never aware of, and that we, what we view as almost immediately, but this school is saying there are these moments actually. And really, I think your question gets at something very profound, which is this school is really getting at something very momentary, actually. So what they're saying is there's a moment of visual, or in this case, visual, it could be auditory, it could be tactile, it could be any, but there's a moment of awareness in direct perception that's the direct valid cognizer, that's new, incontrovertible, and it's a knower. But then you're right, that what seems to us immediately, but in this school they would say, well, wait a second, it's not immediate because there are moments. We then project or overlay or whatever our cognitions, our biases, or whatever, and that to us that seems immediate and intrinsic to the experience. But this school is saying, no, there's a moment there that's actually valid.
It's like it's pre-conceptual. What they're saying is there's a moment that's before you conceptualize what you see.
Yeah, and that we don't usually notice the process, but this school is saying, and it's a really interesting point. So this school is saying, if you were, you might say, one way of saying it is, I guess, so check up, like this school would say, well, check up, really try to notice those moments, in meditation and in your moment-to-moment awareness. Try to really notice that momentary process. And what they would say is, then you will find, if you really check deeply, you will find that there are these moments of, you call it, sometimes, in some traditions they call it bare awareness or something, bare awareness of some visual or auditory, whatever, and that then there's conceptuality. And can you find the gap? Can you find that moment between the direct perception and the conceptual language? And language is always conceptual. And then there's even, there are images that are also conceptual in our mind that are, where we're not using language explicitly, and that are more basic than words, even in a way. But this school, you get what I'm going, at least that's the school's assertion. So it's useful to kind of understand it. And so this school would not, but just to be clear, I just want to finalize that. So this school would not debate, right? They wouldn't say that if you said, well, people have biases, they would say, yes, of course. And if you said, well, people, that people's cognitions and ideas have a huge impact on how they cognize and interact with objects and people, and they would say, of course. But they would say, but there's a basic first moment that's preconceptual in each.
Well, I think what Lynn is saying is that first moment that you're talking about is not the first moment. That tree is a conceptual overlay, that the initial perception are the ones that you gave as an example, green or round or something very basic, and that's the perception. That's the direct perception. And as soon as you say tree or anything else like that, that is conceptual. That is language-based. It is memory-based. There's all kinds of things in your examples, but I don't think that's the direct perception.
Right.
Yeah, well, obviously, only subsequently can we say tree, like I saw a tree, it's like, so yeah, it's difficult to give language to it, but the usual example they give is they give many different examples, but a typical one would be a patch of blue. That's an often one used in Buddhist texts. So they'll say, the direct, so in many Buddhist texts will say, the direct valid cognition of a patch of blue. And then now the person might say sky. Is that sky, or is it a painted wall, or is it, so you're right, in that sense, those would be cognitions. But they would say, the example they often give in text was they would say the patch of blue, that the person had a direct valid cognition or perception of a patch of blue, for example.
Which is like the green of the tree.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So why isn't the tree one step removed? You didn't have a direct perception of the tree.
Oh, I see what you're asking or raising.
I think that's what Lynn was saying from the start.
Exactly. If it's just a split second, I had this experience recently, which is sort of funny. In DC, the kids have just gone back to school, and I had a really rough time with my daughter in her homework when she got into high school. So I was out driving, which is very unusual for me, at 4 o'clock when the schools were actually getting out. So I see this school bus. And for a split second, I had this sinking feeling like, oh my God, I have to go home and do the homework. Even though I haven't done it for years, right? So, but it was the visual of the school bus that led to this feeling. So that was sort of like a split second before I understood what hit me. And then I conceptualized, oh, it's a school bus, which reminds me of X, Y, and Z. But it was a very weird sensation. I mean, maybe that's what you're talking about. It's a direct perception, and you have a feeling, and then you sort of understand later on what gave you that feeling.
I'll say more about it. Sujata had a comment too, so I want to make sure she gets in. Go ahead, Sujata, if you want to, and then we'll sort of.
Well, I mean, I think just I think that the experience is that it's happening way faster than we know it is, and that like there was something before that it feels like it's an immediate sinking feeling of the school bus, but before that there was the perception that we, not having practiced enough, can't get to that more pure pre-conceptual moment. Is that what you're saying, Lauren? Or that, like, even with the tree, okay, like patch of blue is easier because it's just a patch of blue, but even the thing that we're calling tree, you can have a direct perception of a group of things before the mind labels it, before there's conceptuality. So it could be the brown of the stalks and the, green and the shapes and all of that, like a collective. The patch of blue is easier because there's not like it's not a conglomerate, right? But like the idea of the direct perception before I go, oh, fig tree, oh, the squirrels have been eating the figs and feel anger every time I look at my fig tree, right? Like there's just shapes and colors, and there can be a conglomerate thing. So before the school bus triggers, the meaning of school bus triggers school, triggers memories of doing homework with children, there was just like a conglomerate of shapes and colors and motion and all the things. And that was the direct experience, is my understanding of it. And that if we live, so this is where my question comes in. So is this school saying if we lived there all the time, everything was just moment to moment to moment, direct perception without any overlay of bias? Is that the enlightened state? I think I don't understand that. And then I think my second question around this is, right, so we wouldn't have, if we just saw a person, and people have different skin color, and we didn't, that all of these past things and all of these ideas that we have about people with certain skin color didn't arise, right? And we'd all be living this like perfect life if we didn't layer on top of it all of these things. We lived in that first moment of perception, right? So that would be, I think that's a part of my question, which then leads to, there was a line right before the 5 ways of asserting object possessors in the text, which says past and future are both permanent, present and thing are equivalent. And so this has always been my question about this school, is like time. I mean, there's like a big mess in my head around everything about time, but what is the understanding of time? Like, I don't even know how to phrase my question, but here's what it is. If my understanding of their notion of enlightenment is correct, right? Like this pure, first, fresh, like these are the kinds of words you hear from teachers in the school, right? Like present moment, fresh, pure, that's the enlightened state, kind of like living in the pre-conceptual, this like tasting the first taste of the orange before you start to think oranges from my childhood or all the other things, like just the taste of the orange. How do we, it feels like it would lead to a life of like narcissism in a sense, or like individualized experiential blissed outness, instead of having any sense of like, how do we manage life? Like, how do we plant seeds? How do we, how do we choose to grow food? I don't understand how you live in the world with where there has to be forethought of the future if the enlightened state is just this like pure experiential now before concept. That's, I don't know if that made any sense at all.
Wow.
It's like a little bit, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's like living on an edge. That's the way I see it. And you can stay on that edge for a little bit, but eventually you have to get off that edge and go to your life. I mean, you can be in that moment preconceptual for some period of time, but not forever. And maybe that's what you were saying, Sue.
Wow. I'm just pausing. I mean, there were a lot. Actually, I'm pausing because there were a lot of different points that have been raised. So I'll jump around. I'll go back in a minute to the previous ones. I thought I have a quote to share about that one. But first of all, you're right. I did skip a line. I just realized that I had noticed it there. But past and future are both permanent, present, and I think and present. It says present and thing are equivalent, right? One point again. I just want to, part of what that's getting at, which I think is relevant to what we're talking about now also, right, is past and, when it says past and present, future are both permanent, right? What that means is they exist conceptually, right? Because in this school, right, and actually in all Buddhist schools, concepts are eliminative, right? We said, or isolates, or meaning generalities or something, right? So past and future are permanent in the sense that they're what's the word? They're objects. They're not objects of direct perception, right? They're objects of they can only be known through cognition, right? So they're eliminative knowers, I'll call them, or something, right? They're known through negation, so therefore they're permanent. Whereas present and thing are equivalent. That means a present phenomena is an impermanent, momentary phenomena, which also then can be an ultimate truth in this school. So that's part of what's being gotten at there. But I guess I do want to take a couple of thoughts. One is like, according to this school, the key element, I'll say it the right way. This school is not saying that one should never have cognitive ways of knowing. That's an important, I think, distinction, right? That like, so the school is not saying, actually, that's more important. This school is not saying cognition in and of itself is bad, even, right? Or that we shouldn't have cognition. What this school is saying is that, actually, if you think from this school's perspective, what it's saying is grasping at permanence, grasping at gross selflessness, self, and grasping at a subtle self are the cause of suffering. And so in this school, what we want to do is specifically realize subtle impermanence, realize the selflessness of the, that there is no gross self and that there is no subtle self according to this school. And therefore we won't give rise to, from this school's perspective, that we won't, if we realize that, we won't give rise to greed, or attachment, aversion, hatred, ignorance, and so on. So, but this school would not say, but this school would say, if according to this school, if somebody were to say, you know, if the person were to say, I pay homage to the Buddha, right? Like, so whereas if a monk or a nun in this school, for example, were to say, you know, I go to the, I pay homage to the Buddha, I pay homage to the Dharma, I pay homage to the Sangha. Those are concepts, right? In other words, because they're not directly perceiving the Buddha, for example. But this school would say that's a good thing. That's a good practice, right? There is this school, people in this, practitioners of this school take refuge. And that would be a virtuous, positive concept from this school. So this school, so one point is, I just want to point that out, this school is not saying all concepts are bad. You know, and this school would also say, like a practitioner of the school, when they're cultivating loving kindness, and they would have the thought, right? May all beings be happy. That's conceptual, but this school would say that's a good practice. That's a positive practice. It's one of the Brahma Viharas, right? That the school promotes even. So I did want to point out that, so this school would not say that it's never a good thing, that all concepts are bad. What it's saying specifically is that certain concepts, like the concept of, for example, of a substantially existent self, is destructive because it's a self-grasping that gives rise to greed, hatred, and delusion, and so on. You know, so that's one point. So this school is not saying that all concepts are bad. You know, it's saying that concepts have a false element to them, right? Like when I say I take refuge in the Buddha, if I mistake my concept of the Buddha for the actual Buddha, there's a false element to that. But this school is saying, but that's fine. According to this school, actually, it's kind of funny, isn't it? This school would say, well, that's fine though. As long as you realize selflessness of your own self, that doesn't really matter. According to this school, actually, that's true, isn't it? Yeah, that is true, isn't it? So like, in other words, if one were saying, yeah, so because for example, if a stream enterer were saying, I take refuge in the Buddha, this school would say, that's fine. There's no problem there. That's conceptual, but it's, what's the word? That's a conceptual thought because it's past, right? The Buddha existed in the past. The Buddha is not present in front of that person. The concept of refuge is conceptual also. You know, so I just wanted to point that out. So one point is, like, this school is not saying that all concepts are the cause of suffering, but this school is saying that certain concepts are the cause of suffering. So that's one point. But then I want to go back because I think it might help address a number of questions that were raised. And I'm quoting Lati Rinpoche again. It's a very good book he has, Mind in Tibetan Buddhism. And where he's talking about direct perceivers, because it's getting into more detail here. And it's getting at what some of the points you guys were making and raising, which is, so what it's saying here, I'm going to read a quote. He's talking about what does it mean to say free from conceptuality, right? Which is direct perception. And he says, find the exact quote here. He says, in our own system, he gave different, I'm not going to go into all the details because he gave like ideas that other people have presented about what it means to be free from conceptuality. He disagreed with them. And then he says, what can be posited correctly as the definition of free from conceptuality? Because that's what you guys some of you were asking about. And then he says, in our own system, it is that which is free from being a determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality and a meaning generality as suitable to be mixed. And so it's getting at this point. So I'll continue. Thus, a non-conceptual consciousness is defined as being that which lacks the attributes of defining a conceptual consciousness. That is, it lacks being a determinative knower that apprehends sound and meaning generalities as suitable to be mixed. So I want to point out there are a number of points he's making there that are subtle. One is, it's not, and I think, Jeff, you were saying this. One point he's making is it's not language-based, right? So in other words, if we say the word tree, it's already mixing a sound generality, tree, with a meaning generality, which we'll get to in a second, right? So one is it's pre-linguistic, right? that's the meaning of where he says sound generality. That means sound generality means language, right? A label. But then he's making another point here where he says it's also lacks being a determinative knower, right? So a determinative knower in this translation, this is Jeffrey Hopkins translating, is what I was calling earlier. There are many different ways. We called it an eliminative knower, right? Or isolating, knowing by way of isolation. But anyway, what we're getting at there is determinative knowers, as we were getting at earlier, generally meaning generalities, as he's calling them, by eliminating, right? So there's when he says the sound generality and meaning generality is suitably mixed, I want to describe what he's getting at there, right? What he's getting at is I have a word tree, right? That's a sound generality. Then I have a meaning generality, which is my mental image or mental idea of tree, which eliminates everything. So he says determinative knower, it means I'm eliminating everything that's not tree, right? So I know a tree is not a bush, a tree is not a house, a tree is not a whatever, right? And so conceptual knowers, what he's saying here is a knower that's conceptual mixes a sound generality, like the word tree, with a meaning generality, meaning a mental image that's a determinative knower that knows by way of negation, right? And its object, therefore, as we've covered in the previous class, is permanent, right? Meaning not changing instant by instant. It's not a functioning thing. It's not a real tree, for example, right? So what this is saying is a direct, how does he say in the text, a direct perceiver is a non-mistaken knower free of conceptuality. So what he's saying, what does it mean free of conceptuality? It means there's no language and there's no determinative knower, meaning there's no concept of tree present that's, let's say this right. There's no concept of tree present that's a negative phenomena that eliminates everything not tree. Now I want to go back though and share something else. So that's, I just wanted to clarify. So when our text says free from conceptuality, that's what it means, according to Lhasa Rinpoche, who's a great philosopher and former abbot. He passed away, but he was the abbot of Ganden, Chartse, I think, monastery. But then,
So Lauren, can you directly perceive a tree?
that's what I'm about to get back to. I asked, I'm going to go back to actually my note, because what I want to describe now is this, because this is a topic I actually talked with Khenze Rinpoche about, because it was subtle also. And also it's in the text. So I want to kind of describe how this school, you guys are asking profound questions. So I want to describe something about how this school talks about perception, right? So according to this school, actually, they're sense direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers, and then perceivers that know by way of cognition, right? And so what this school says actually is that, let me use, and actually, let me just, hold on one second. Let me actually find the note from Khenze Rinpoche. Yeah, so it's an interesting subtle point. Like, what this school says is like, so let's say, I'm going to use the example of visual consciousness, but you could pick any consciousness, right? So according to this school, what they would say is this, is, so first, let's say, it's actually very, so I'm going to go back to my example. So let's say you walk outside, you're on a hike or something, and you look up and you see what I'm going to use the word tree. We're going to get subtle here. But you're not using language yet at this point, right? But so the person looks up and sees what I'm calling a tree, right? So in that first instant, there's what this school would call, what we just called here, right? A direct, valid cognizer, right? The first instant of eye consciousness looking is a direct, valid cognizer, which means it's new, it's incontrovertible, and it's a knower, it's an awareness, right? That's only true of the first instant, right? Then the person continues to look, right? It's not just one instant of looking, right? You're not, I mean, like an instant is extremely brief in Buddhism, right? So then the person continues to look. So then at that point, and we're talking about like less than, what's the word? Like maybe much, much less than a finger snap, right? So there's this first instant, which is direct, valid, cognizer, visual knower. Then there are some subsequent moments. And in one text, give an example. Imagine like there's one moment which is direct, valid, cognizer. Then it gives us an example. It says, then imagine there are 5 moments of subsequent non-mistaken direct perceiving visual consciousness of that object, right? So now that just means the eye consciousness is continuing to look, right? At that point, there's still no conceptuality. Does that make sense? So the first one, the first instant, I'm going to call it, was a direct, valid cognizer because it was new, incontrovertible, and a knower. The subsequent 4 instants, my fictional example, they actually came from a text, a teaching, but are still non-conceptual, right? Now these could be, like I'm going to say, like, there are different Buddhist schools that talk about what's an instant. Some say an instant is like 1/64th of a finger snap. Some say it's 300 something of a finger snap, right? So what they're saying is in that short amount of time, right, there might be a first instant that's a direct, valid cognizer, a visual knower, right? Next, there come 4 moments of direct perception that are they're not new, so they're not valid cognizers, but they're direct perceivers that are non-mistaken and free from conceptuality. So there's still no conceptuality, right? So there's no word tree, there's no mental image of tree yet. There's just visual consciousness, right? Then there's an instant that's a direct, that's a mental cognizer, where the mind, for an instant, gives rise to an image of tree. And one thing that's interesting is what they say in this school is non-Aryas are never aware of that instant. So in other words, if you're not an Arya, you're never aware of that. You're never aware of that level of detail of your own experience, according to this school. I mean, you guys asked, so I'm going to this level of detail now. So this school is saying, now so what this school is saying is Aryas are aware of this level of detail, meaning people have seen selflessness, but ordinary persons are never aware of this level of detail. So what this is saying is, right, there's the first instant, which is direct, valid cognition. Then there are, an example they gave in a text, there are 4 instances of direct perception that are non-conceptual and visual consciousness that are like that. Then there's an instant of a mental direct perceiver, actually, where the mind perceives whatever that visual was. And then, in my example, using Lottie Rinpoche's language, then after that, there's somebody said, like the person may have the thought, tree, right? And with that tree comes a mental image of tree, right? And that's a sound generality and meaning generality being mixed, suitably mixed, right? And what's really interesting is ordinarily we never notice any of that, and we certainly never notice, now I have a mental image of tree which I'm mixing with the tree, right? But that's what's happening. And yeah,
following Sujata's line of thought, that first instant, right, that first single instant, that instant can contain more than one direct perception. Is that right? In other words, can that first instant include green and brown and shape? They're not subsequent instances. They're all the direct perception, but there are subparts of that, right? Or are those separate instances, but they're not separated by time, or are they?
To be honest, that is a topic that's talked about in great detail in the mind-only school. Like, in other words, are those different colors, for example? To be honest, honestly, I don't know. Like, in other words, there is when I don't know the Sautantric, like, in other words, if the person looks up and sees, in my example, right, they're on a hike, they look up and for the first time they see a particular object, which we're calling a tree, right? To be honest, I don't know what the Sautrantrika's position is. Like I'm not sure I've ever heard it, actually. I've seen the mind-only school's position on those kind. They have different, mind-only school philosophers debate. Some say they can all be one, some say they have to be separate, I don't know, to be honest, what Sautantrika say. I mean, there is like, because when you see a tree, you're right? There's green, there's brown, there's whatever. There might be varied colors and shapes.
Those are all first instance views.
Yeah.
That first instance, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my own thinking is, it seems to me that they would have to all be in one instant, but I'm not sure. I mean, that's my own thinking, but I'm not sure that's what Dharmakirti would say. To be honest, I've never seen or heard an answer to Dharmakirti's, for example, stance on that specific question. So I'm not, and from a Sautantrika perspective, so I'm not sure.
Doesn't the answer to that question lead to the next mental step, which assigns tree to that conglomeration of direct perceptions? I mean, that's where the mental conception of tree comes from, is that construction of those instantaneous elements that you name tree, but only based on certain of those direct perceptions.
Actually, one just small, to some extent, I think what you're saying is true, but I just want to differentiate one point, is that there is our meaning generality of tree. It's probably the most important point is what's the object of direct perception. This is a really interesting point, isn't it? The object of direct perception is an impermanent functioning thing, right? That produces, and according to this goal, the really important point is it's an impermanent functioning thing that produces effects from its own side, like future trees and oxygen and so on, right? Whereas our meaning generality of tree is produced by a mental process of negation, according to this school, right? According to all Buddhist schools, actually. So our mental image of tree is produced by, a mental process of negation. And it's an interesting point. Yeah, and it's not, and I guess I just want to emphasize that point because I think it's important, is that mental image of tree is not, what's the way they said it here, is false in the sense that it's not a tree, right? It's a permanent phenomenon, it's not a tree. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, right? In other words, like if it says that's, like in other words, if you're a arborist or a naturalist or something, and and your thought is, oh, that's a juniper or something, it could be correct, right? It's false in the sense that your generic image or your cognitive image of juniper is not juniper, but it could also be correct in the sense that you could correctly identify a juniper. But yeah, so I guess so of course, though, that's connected to the specific shapes and specific colors. But so yes, that's correct. But I don't know, is there more to what, I'm not sure if there's more to what you were saying, Jeff.
Oh, I'm sure there's less to what I'm saying. I don't know what I'm saying.
I guess I'm just trying to really emphasize this point that cognitions are these cognitive ways of knowing are eliminative knowers, I'm going to call them, right? They're negations, therefore they're not impermanent. They're permanent in the Buddhist sense, right? Not eternal, but not momentary, right? And that there's one, they mix a sound generality, the word tree, with a meaning generality. The meaning generality is what he called a determinative knower, or I called it an eliminative knower, right? It's known by way of negation. It's not impermanent in that sense, right? And it's not the same as the tree, right? So direct perceivers are these individual, are these momentary experiences. And so, I mean, Jeff's point is correct, really, right? That there is, it's hard to have language for this, but in other words, when you a direct perception of a tree can't, by definition, doesn't include the word tree, because as soon as you have the word tree, you've mixed a sound generality and a meaning generality. It's linguistic, therefore it's conceptual. So it can't include the word tree or the concept of tree. Or as Lottie Rinpoche says, that's the definition of a non-conceptual knower, is it doesn't include language and meaning generalities. One other point, though, I just want to make, though, actually, I won't make one more point, and this is going to confuse things a little, but that's okay, I think. I'll make one more point, which is also, though, one of the omnipresent mental factors according to Buddhist, let's see here, according to Buddhist psychology, one of the omnipresent mental factors is discrimination. And so I want to point that out. So in that sense, omnipresent mental factor, discernment. I'll actually give you the definition here. So even direct perceptions do discern. But they discern non-conceptually. I think that's an important distinction. What's that?
By being eliminative?
No, they're not eliminative. Actually, I'll read you the definition from, this is also, this is from Geshe Rabton. So I'll just read you the definition just to clarify this point about discern, because I think that's actually, I think some of the questions you guys are raising are getting at this point. So I'll actually read it. So first of all, there are 5 omnipresent mental, this is beyond our real scope here, because this comes from Buddhist, another set of Buddhist teachings, but it's getting at what you're asking about. So discern, and so omnipresent means it's always there. So the mind, according to Buddhist psychology, all moments of awareness have an element of discernment to them. We don't always discern correctly, but we're always discerning. And discernment is defined as a distinct mental factor having the function of identifying the object to be one thing as opposed to another by means of differentiation. This is an inherent quality of mind whose task it is to distinguish one thing from another. Now, here's the point about cognitive versus non-cognitive. So it does that discernment. Cognitive, so it says here, conceptions do it with terms and phrases. Or by making, cognitive distinctions between objects. But here it is. No, so I'm sorry. Let me actually read the quote. This is an inherent quality of mind whose task it is to distinguish one object from another, either by identifying it with terms and phrases, as in the case of most conceptions, or by merely making a distinction between objects, as in the case of perceptions. Thus, it is present in all forms of cognition, playing an essential role in abstract thought and imagination, as well as in the simplest visual and audible perceptions. According to their bases, there are 6 forms of discernment, ranging from discernment associated with visual contact up to discernment associated with mental contact. And it gives an example here. There's a kind of discernment that that young children have who have not yet learned any language, and does not discern based on names and terms, and so on. So the point here is that what all Buddhist schools, and this school would agree, is that there is a kind of discernment that's cognitive and language based, and that it mixes a meaning generality and a sound generality. But there's also a kind of discernment that the eye consciousness itself does, or ear consciousness does, that's not conceptual and that's not language based, but is a kind of very, is a, what the word, how do they say it here? But it's still a distinguishing between objects. So, and that's the Buddhist view. So that the I consciousness distinguishes between two different objects in a way that's not conceptual, but is still determined, is still makes some kind of discernment, or yeah, that's the word. Lynn.
This is interesting because this answers the question of, can you be in a non-conceptual state and still discern sounds and vision? Mm-hmm. And what it suggests to me, at least, is that, artists or musicians, that's where they create things. It's a non-conceptual in the typical sense, but it's a discerning state.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? So like the ear consciousness can discern. Yeah, for sure. The ear consciousness can definitely, for example, can discern.
But it's not conceptual. It doesn't have to be conceptual.
Right. And then there's another kind of discernment that is conceptual. Yeah.
How is discernment not eliminative?
I think there's so all, actually it's an important point. So all according to this, so we can say this way, all conceptual discernment is eliminative, right? But what this text was saying, and what Buddhism is really saying, is that when the I consciousness, like, actually, I'll go back to my example for myself. Like when I saw that swirling, right? I know there was a moment where I wasn't thinking, wow, or I wouldn't have had any language yet. But my I consciousness could see the difference between the flat, whatever, the whiteness that was of one type and the whiteness of another type. And there was the I consciousness itself was able to distinguish one shade and shape of white from another of the snow. Then you label it something. So I think it's like that. It's pre-linguistic, or like a child, like a pre-linguistic child, right? Who, actually, that's true, isn't it? Like a pre-linguistic child. They actually get, if you think of scientific studies, actually, where like, think of that, like a child in the womb, right? Who, if they hear, they've done some kind of measurements. I can't remember how they measure it, but I guess it's the child's heartbeat or something. They're certain, right? Where if the child hears the mother's voice versus some other voice, it reacts differently. And that's not through, they would say that's not through a conceptuality about mothers, or it doesn't yet have language. But its ear consciousness by that age can distinguish sound in a way that affects the child. But it's not conceptual, according to, that would be an example.
Lauren, when you were, just before you were saying that, I was thinking about this time when I was pregnant and I was standing on a subway platform and I saw the train coming, and I knew that there were people standing too close and that I suspected that the horn would blow. So I wasn't anxious about it, but the horn did blow and my child did a full, freaked out and flipped around in my stomach, right? Just from the experience of that horn blowing. And I was, noticing later that it wasn't that I was afraid, and I was like, it was one of those first moments where I was like, I disabused myself of the notion that it was like always going to be my neurosis that was going to mess up my kid. Like I wasn't afraid of the horn. The kid freaked out all on its own in my stomach, right? Like that was, but he doesn't know what a train is. He doesn't know what standing close to a train platform is. He doesn't even know it's a train, right? But that's how he fully reacted inside my belly. It was so, and I always wondered, like, what is that experience of fear or discomfort, whatever it was that made him do what he did, which did not feel like a pleasant experience for him or me, right? But that there's no train, there's no, I don't even know if it was sound for him or vibrations or what was happening, right? So that was I've been thinking about that as we were talking. I think that where that gets confusing for me is that there's still like, there's no concepts, there's experience, and there's still like, there's self-grasping is already there. There's, I don't know. So that just, it's a, yeah, I think I'm really confused in this school about, and it goes back to the other thing I was asking, like, what is the enlightened state look like in the school? I think that it sort of, I don't agree with it, but it makes sense to me to say that like pure direct experience, if you pre-labeling, could be, you know, a state of like bliss or non-confusion or something. I don't know. I don't feel like I understand the end goal here.
One point also is good to remember is that this school's, you know, we'll get into it later in the text, but this school's sense of the text doesn't go into detail about it, because this school's sense of the I was going to say grounds and paths, the soteriology, I was going to say, but you know, the grounds and paths is the same really as the Vaibhashikas. So the text doesn't go into detail about it, but you know, so in a sense, right, like, I was going to say it right. Yeah, for this school, really the goal, right, though, is to realize it's that whole thing about, you know, which I don't want to go into detail about now because it's not the main topic, but you know, if you think about it from this school's perspective, the goal is actually a kind of extinguishment of suffering, right? And for them, the rest, like, you know, yeah, for them, the rest is sort of not that important or something, you know, like, so, but, you know, like the arhats, right, like, there are arhats with remainder, right, who still have a body and are still going around, and but they would, yeah, actually an arhat would still have, according to this school, like, you would have to say an arhat still has concepts, right? Or as they have, but they don't have self-grasping anymore. And they're, so actually, if you think of what's their goal, is actually a kind of, it's that extinguishment thing we talked about before. But, oh, and again, though, so you get the idea here that there are definitely these, what's it say, right? There is a kind of discernment or differentiating that's on the sensory level, and then there's a discernment or differentiating that's on a cognitive level. And I'll just go, actually, because people have been asking, yeah, I mean, it's fine, we're going slow because people, it sounds like it's important to people. So I wanted to say, in terms of the 3 parts also of pramana, just to clarify that, right? Like, so, and I said, this idea of, was it new, right? So I said before, like, new is, all Buddhist schools except Prasangika Madhyamikas include that in their definition. I said that already. And Geshe Rabten, he used a different instead of new, that his translator said fresh. You could say either one, same Tibetan word, he just translates it differently. Right, and he says, and instead of a valid cognition, he calls it an ideal state of mind. But anyway, it's the same pramana. He says, the characteristic of freshness indicates that an ideal state of mind only occurs as the initial act of the initial awareness act or cognitive act within any correlated series of cognitions. For example, we may comprehend sound to be impermanent in dependence upon a logical proof. The initial moment of that comprehension, when we fully grasp that point, is pramana. After that, it's not pramana. So that's one. So that's one point he's saying, that new, it means he's getting it. It's the first moment. Then he says, and instead of how did this translator says incontrovertible. I'm just trying to give people a sense of this because it seems like there are a lot of questions. So he says instead infallible. That's there, instead of incontrovertible, he says infallible. He says the second defining characteristic of a pramana is infallibility. This means that a pramana is a mind that comprehends its object. it means that is able to lead to a correct ascertainment of that object. And it could be either perceptual or cognitive or conceptual. And I'm going to give an example here. He says, an example, I think this gets at some of the questions people were raising, so I'm just going to read you a quote. An example of a perception that comprehends its object would be a visual perception of a rose that creates a sufficient impression on the mind to be able to induce a correct conceptual ascertainment that the object seen was a rose. So that's his example of a visual valid cognition, right? Would be a visual perception that comprehends its object would be a visual perception of a rose that creates a sufficient impression on the mind to be able to induce a correct conceptual ascertainment that the object was a rose. Furthermore, since upon the basis of this perception, there is no possibility of misconceiving the rose to be anything other than a rose, it is said to be able to capable of eliminating misconceptions about the object. And the last is that, it's a knower. It's he calls it cognition. Yeah, so those are the elements of these pramana moments, right? And you get the idea. I mean, he's saying it there too, that valid cognition, right? If it's new, that by definition means it's always momentary. It's a moment, right? And they also, do you get the sense here also, I just want to make sure people are getting this, that they're really talking about like this school, I mean, Buddhist psychology is talking about how there are these sequences of moments of perception, right? And so it's getting at like that perception is a process, right? That begins with, not all begin with valid cognition, right? It could begin with a, if the person, so I mean, I want to be clear of that too. Not all perceptions begin with direct valid cognitions. For example, let's say a person was let's say I was having some kind of condition where my eyes were crossed and I looked up and saw 2 moons, right? So my first moment would be not be a valid cognition. Then I saw 2 moons. There's only one on this planet, right? So that would be a wrong consciousness that started a sequence. But there can be, regardless though, there are these sequences in perception, that there are these sort of sequences in reference to certain objects. And that you get the idea here that the direct valid cognizers, or the sense consciousness in particular, do kind of have a basic discernment, but are non-conceptual, don't mix sound generality, the meaning generality. They directly perceive impermanent phenomena. There's a sequence of that, and then that gives rise to conceptuality, which does mix sound and meaning generalities. Sujata has your hand up.
When you were reading from Lati Rinpoche earlier, and you're talking about the first one being, so that's the new and incontrovertible moment, right? And then there were 4 more right after that, but those were pre-conceptual. And I got the sense, and maybe I misunderstood, that they were almost identical to the first one. What I don't understand what happens, or if there's any description of what happens that leads to sort of, it seems like going down the wrong path of starting to layer things on top of it, right? Or maybe going down the right path. I think I think I was misunderstanding that there can be conceptualizations, et cetera, that's not necessarily inaccurate. Sorry, I'm having so much trouble with this. So I'm having trouble understanding like how that trajectory happens away from that new incontrovertible, and particularly maybe it would be helpful to understand more about those 4 moments and how they're different than that first one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so first of all, just so you know, like as we go through the text, there will be detailed descriptions. So those are called subsequent cognizers, and that'll be covered in this chapter. Or in this section of this chapter, is those will be called subsequent cognizers, which are still, as the text the section we just covered points out, it says direct perceivers are, so those would be examples in the paragraph we were just on, or are just on. It says the definition of a direct perceiver is a non-mistaken knower free of conceptuality. So those would still be direct perceivers, right? Free of conceptuality and non-mistaken. And they would be called subsequent technically in this school, they would be labeled subsequent cognizers. And they would still be direct perception. They would be subsequent cognizers, so therefore not direct valid cognizers, but they would still be non-mistaken. And they're normal. There's nothing wrong with those. Like in other words, from this school's perspective, those are not a problem. They're not something pathological or negative. But I want to also just say one other thing that I think might get at your point, Sujata. I'm not sure if it will or not, but this, if you think of Dharmakirti, for example, like he puts a great emphasis, actually. I mean, and the Dalai Lama follows Dharmakirti very much in this way. Like, so Dharmakirti's actually view is that most of actually I want to emphasize this because I think it's getting at some of the question you're raising. Dharmakirti actually, his view is that much of our Dharma practice actually is cognitive in this sense. In other words, it's coming to inferential cognitions that are correct. And that in a sense, much of our spiritual goal actually is to counteract our, there are these terms from this school like wrong consciousnesses and doubts that we want to, much of the practice of Dharma actually is using reasoning to correct our wrong consciousness and correct our doubts by giving rise to what he called here, the translator called it inferential valid cognitions, actually. In other words, so actually a lot of our Dharma practice, and when the Dalai Lama makes those jokes where he says, we use reasoning, we use logic, because we came from the tradition of, that Shantarakshita brought to Tibet, the lineage of reasoning, that came, and he carried the lineages of Dharmakirti and Dignaga. What he's getting at is this, actually, is that much of our Dharma practice actually is not just to go to direct perception and leave behind conceptual ways of knowing. It's actually to cultivate correct conceptual insights through inferential cognition, and actually, because actually to have a direct valid cognizer, all you have to do is open your ears, open your eyes, open your, somebody slaps you in the face, you have a direct valid cognizer of that sensation. But that doesn't lead to liberation, actually. Like, so his Dharmakirti's point actually is that, is that what we're actually trying to cultivate are inferential valid cognizers, right? So inferential cognitions that are new, incontrovertible, and know definitively their object. And the spiritual path actually is, for example, so they give this example, many Buddhist texts are often giving this example where they say, sound is impermanent because it's a product, right? And what they're trying to get at actually is that what we want to do is realize subtle impermanence through, and what they're saying is you realize that through a correct reason, actually. And then eventually you can directly perceive it. But first you realize it through a correct reason. Or, there's no permanent, unitary, independent self, right? What they're saying is you realize that through a correct reason, actually. And then eventually you can realize it directly. And so this school actually is saying, really, if you think of especially the followers of reasoning in this school, they're actually saying, we want to cultivate correct reasons, actually, and get these experiences of pramana really with regard to correct inferential valid cognitions, which will then lead to direct perceptions, which grant us liberation. So this school is not just saying, oh, just go to direct perception. And it's not saying that eliminative knowers are unhealthy. It's actually saying we want to use eliminative knowers to correctly cognize inferentially the truth in order to liberate ourselves. Yeah. Did that get at what you were really getting at, though, or not?
I think so. I think I realize where I'm really getting hung up is on this word valid. And so my mind does the thing invalid in opposition. So if you just said like a subsequent mind can be a direct perceiver and it's non-mistaken. So I'm having trouble with things like, how is something non-mistaken but not valid? at the same, like, I think I need to just spend some more time.
I agree. Yeah, that's a really confusing point in this school. And, and I don't like, that's why sometimes I just switch back to pramana, like in my own language for myself, is I find the word valid cognizer, I do the same thing then. Sometimes I'm like, well, then it's not valid. But if you're looking at something, you're seeing it and it's non-mistaken. So I find the English word, the English phrase valid, I mean, it's a reasonable translation, I suppose, but it can be confusing a little bit too. So that's why sometimes I go back to it's not a pramana, but it is a non-mistaken knower, right? And and I guess what they're getting at is that there's something very powerful about these pramana, and if you think of like, because actually from a practical perspective, I often think this, like, well, if you go back to a practical level of our own spiritual practice, what we actually want are these, what we're seeking in a way are these pramana moments of realizing impermanence, of realizing selflessness, according to this school, right? And that those are moments that transform a person, and that because it's that first moment. Now, the subsequent moments that are not pramana, you need those actually. Like, actually, do you mind? I'm going to go off on just a very short tangent that might help answer this point. Because it's not in this text, but a couple months ago, I was reading something by Lama Tsongkhapa where he talked about how there are 16 moments. They often say this. They're on the path of seeing. This school says the same thing. All these Buddhist, many of these Buddhist schools say there are 16 moments. Some different schools give different numbers. Some say 14 or say, I don't know, there are different numbers. But they sometimes say there are 16 moments on the path of seeing, where a person becomes an Arya, right? And Lama Tsongkhapa says, well, what does that mean, 16 moments? Because you're in at that point, you're in a non-conceptual direct perception of emptiness, right? Or selflessness in this school. So what does it mean to say there are 16 moments? And I was like, I have no idea. It didn't make sense to me. And then what Lama Tsongkhapa was getting at in a way was that there's a first, in the path of seeing, there's a first instant, which is the direct pramana of selflessness. But then there are another series of moments where one is continuing to directly perceive selflessness. And he makes a point that like, those are transformative. That like, in other words, the first moment is absolutely required. It's like the one that induces all the others. But it's the staying in that experience that transforms a being, permanently transformed. They're not permanently in the Buddhist sense, but forever transforms that being. For all future time transforms that being. And he gives an analogy. He says, like, it's like in ordinary life, like where you have this first moment of knowing something, but then you stay with that and it affects you, and you have to go back to it. You have to or you dwell in that awareness. And that awareness of something is powerful and transformative. And so what we're wanting actually are these moments, the pramana moment of that first valid cognition, especially of selflessness. But then there are subsequent moments of that, that are very important to transform our being in a way. Anyway, so I think that's, if you think of pramana, it gets at how we perceive ordinary things like each other and trees and houses and cars, but it also gets at ultimately what we're seeking is a pramana of selflessness in this school, selflessness of persons. Big topics though, right? I'm just sort of pausing. I don't think we just have a couple minutes left, so it doesn't make sense to go on to the next paragraph. So any other comments or questions about what we already covered, or should I say a couple more things? Or good? Okay. And I guess maybe I'll just stop. The final thing I'll say is I just want to suggest, like, these are, I do want to say, like, a few points. One is, while there are differences between, Sautrantikas and Madhyamikas, most of these points, again, there's a difference, right? Prasanghikas don't say new, right? They say an incontrovertible knower. They leave out the new. But for the most part, these points of Buddhist, what do we say, psychology and epistemology, right? Meaning ways of knowing, apply to all the higher Buddhist schools as well. So it's not that, whereas like Madhyamikas don't refute most of these points. They would agree with them, is one point. And then another point is like, And so this whole idea of like valid cognition or pramana and direct valid cognition, inferential valid cognition, right? And I just want to suggest like contemplate, there's going to be a break of a few weeks until the next class. So, and we're going to go further into these topics, but I just want to suggest like contemplating them, in your experience, like really sort of going like, what does that mean experientially? What does that mean about my own cognitions? And you don't have to agree with Buddhism, but at least that, this is the Buddhist teaching on how cognition and perception work. And they're getting at a level of detail that that people don't usually think about, is I guess my point, right? They're getting at a level of detail that's like, again, like that's what's the right word? Like, I don't, what's the word for that when it's like that the whole sequence is taking place in 1 second. They're talking about a sequence of events that all take place within a second or something. So it's a level of detail about perception that's extremely detailed and subtle, and all I'm suggesting is just to contemplate it a little bit, to go like, okay, how does that relate to my experience? Does that make sense to me? Can I understand what that means? What does it mean to be a non-mistaken knower, free of conceptuality? And I gave the definition from Ladi Rinpoche because this author doesn't give it, but right, so that there's no meaning generality, there's no sound generality, right? But there's still discernment there, and then subsequently after that, there could be still direct perception, and then conceptuality kicks in, you'd say, right? And go back to the examples. I just want to encourage people to go back, like, even the example, like Lynn, your example about policing, like really go back, because like they're getting a level of detail that is different level of detail, and to go like, you were getting a really important point, right? But like this is getting at a level of detail of like, wow, how do my biases work? And at what point, like, and actually I'm going to say one more thing, like Sujata's example of the child, her child, right, in her womb still, so like when a child hears the mother's voice, it's like it relaxes. When a child hears apparently a loud train horn, it flips over. The child flips over, right? And to contemplate, like, I'm trying to say this the right way. Why do we react to why do we react to one way and another way, right? Like, because that's getting at, right, what that's getting at is the basis, right? What Buddhism is getting, if you think of Buddhist psychology, but these points are getting at certain things we like, certain things we don't like, right? That's fundamental. That's not unique to humans, right? Like all sentient beings have that, right? And that comes from perception. And how do our perceptions work? And at what point does liking or not liking kick in? I'm just giving you examples. These are things you can think about in reference to these topics. So I'm just encouraging people to contemplate it, and then we'll sort of go deeper into this school's views of, really, it's like, it's a epistemology is what I would call this. It's how do we know what we know? And anyway, and what ways do we miss? How do we get things wrong? And how do we get them right? And this school is saying it's possible, and this school is saying something really important, which is, it's not just relativism, right? There are actual wrong consciousnesses, and there are actual valid cognitions, and you can get things wrong or you can get them right, and that's really important. And from a Buddhist perspective, that's important because it's the foundation of liberation. But also, the school is saying in daily life, I just want to put that. That's why we're talking about like things like people's cognitions about, and people's cognitive ways of relating, whether it's about, anyway, right now it's about everything, isn't it? Like in our culture, in America right now, it's about, there's no topic that's not a point like that. And I guess I do want to say that, like, Dharma Kirti would say it's not, there are correct ways of knowing, there are incorrect ways of knowing. And that's really important, isn't it? Like, whether it's about viruses or, transmission rates, or how viruses are transmitted, or about race, or about vaccines, or about whatever, 100 other topics. you know, this school is founded in this view that you can come to valid cognition about things. And you can also get them wrong. And if you get them wrong, it leads to suffering. And if you get them right, it leads to less suffering or no suffering if you get selflessness right. So I think this school is very profound in that way. Anyway. Okay, so we should do our dedication. The supreme jewel Bodhichitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for really interesting questions.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Have a good few weeks.